In a small town in the southern United States, a young man named Jamal was doing his best to make ends meet. Jamal, in his early 20s, was full of ambition, but trapped in a cycle of economic hardship. Living in a modest, run-down rental property, he faced constant challenges. The house had leaky pipes, creaky floors, and a broken heating system, issues that went unresolved no matter how many times he reported them to his landlords, the Petersons. The Petersons, an older white couple in their late 50s, owned several properties in the area. However, they had a reputation for being difficult landlords, especially toward tenants like Jamal. Mrs. Peterson was especially vocal, often making racially charged comments disguised as concerns about the neighborhood, while Mr. Peterson would visit unannounced to inspect the property, often finding reasons to scold Jamal for minor things. "You're lucky we even rented to you," Mrs. Peterson had once said with a smug look. "This isn't the kind of place just anyone can afford, you know." Jamal, holding back his frustration, simply nodded. He couldn't afford to retaliate or move elsewhere. He worked multiple part-time jobs, barely managing to cover rent and utilities. Despite the harassment, Jamal remained polite and focused on his dreams of starting his own tech company. He often spent his nights coding and learning new skills, using the single outdated laptop he'd saved up to buy. One winter evening, things escalated. The heating in the house stopped working completely, and despite repeated calls to the Petersons, no one came to fix it. Jamal was left shivering under layers of blankets, using a small space heater he'd borrowed from a friend. Days turned into weeks, and when Jamal finally managed to reach Mrs. Peterson, her response was curt and dismissive. "If you don't like it, you can leave," she snapped. "Maybe someone else will appreciate this house more." Shortly after, the Petersons began increasing the rent without notice, pushing Jamal closer to eviction. It was clear they wanted him out, but Jamal didn't have the resources to fight back legally or move to a better place. He endured, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing him fail. Months later, Jamal noticed a "for sale" sign suddenly appear in front of the house. Word around the neighborhood was that the Petersons were facing financial troubles of their own. A failed business venture had left them in debt, and they were scrambling to sell off properties to stay afloat. The house Jamal was renting was one of the first on the chopping block. Jamal felt a small glimmer of satisfaction, but he pushed the thought aside. He had bigger priorities, like finding a new place to live. As he began searching, he received an unexpected call from a tech investor he had pitched his ideas to months earlier. The investor had been impressed by Jamal's determination and creativity and offered to fund his startup. Overnight, Jamal's life began to change. With the investment, Jamal launched his company, focusing on creating affordable tech solutions for underserved communities. The business quickly gained traction, and within a year, Jamal found himself financially stable for the first time in his life. He moved into a better apartment, hired a small team, and began expanding his company's reach. Meanwhile, the Petersons struggled to find a buyer for the house. The property's poor condition and years of neglect had left it in a state of disrepair. After months on the market, they finally received an offer from an anonymous buyer. Eager to rid themselves of the financial burden, they quickly agreed to the terms. The day of the sale arrived, and the Petersons sat across from their lawyer, along with the lawyer representing the buyer. The buyer, however, was notably absent. When the documents were signed, Mr. Peterson asked, "So when do we get to meet this buyer?" The buyer's lawyer replied politely, "The new owner prefers to handle introductions directly. You'll meet them soon." Satisfied with the sale, the Petersons returned to the property to pack their belongings. They still had a few days to vacate and wanted to clear the house out quickly. Boxes were stacked high, and tension hung in the air as they moved furniture and wrapped up fragile items. As they worked, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Peterson opened it, expecting movers or perhaps a neighbor. Instead, she found herself face to face with Jamal. He stood confidently on the porch, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, a striking contrast to the struggling tenant they had known. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Peterson demanded, her tone a mix of confusion and irritation. "I'm here to see the property," Jamal said calmly, stepping inside as though he owned the place. Mr. Peterson approached, his face reddening. "You're trespassing, boy. This isn't your house anymore." Jamal smirked, holding up a set of keys. "Actually, it is." For a moment, silence filled the room as the realization sank in. Mrs. Peterson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, while Mr. Peterson looked as though he might collapse. "You?" Mrs. Peterson finally croaked. "How could you possibly afford this place?" Jamal straightened his tie, his voice steady. "Let's just say hard work pays off. I saw an opportunity and I took it." The Petersons could only watch helplessly as Jamal walked through the house, inspecting every corner. He didn't gloat or rub their misfortune in their faces. Instead, he turned to them with a measured expression. "This house represents a lot to me," Jamal said. "It's where I learned resilience, where I realized that no matter how much people try to bring you down, you can rise above it." Mrs. Peterson bristled. "Well, I hope you're happy." Jamal smiled faintly. Happiness doesn't come from seeing others fail. It comes from knowing you've overcome. As the Petersons packed the last of their belongings into a moving truck, Jamal stood on the porch, watching them leave. The house was his now, a symbol of his perseverance and the poetic justice life had delivered. Jamal didn't keep the house for himself. Instead, he renovated it, fixing the broken heating system, repairing the plumbing, and giving it a fresh coat of paint. Then he rented it out to a struggling single mother and her 2 children, people who reminded him of where he had once been. This time, the tenants had a landlord who genuinely cared about their well-being. Jamal's story is a powerful reminder of the concept of karma. What goes around truly does come around. The Petersons lost everything because of their greed and prejudice, while Jamal, through kindness and determination, rose above and claimed the life he had always dreamed of. This is more than just a story of triumph. It's a lesson in humility, perseverance, and the undeniable power of justice. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video, share it with friends, and subscribe to Story Dash for more incredible tales like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that shows the power of resilience and kindness. Thank you for watching, and remember, what you put into the world always comes back to you. See you in the next video.